Hi, you're listening to Marcia Pally and conversations I'm having with people about the criteria we should use to design and implement our economic and political policies. What should be our basic framework for determining public policy? These conversations are based on ideas from a book of mine, Commonwealth and Covenant, Economics, Politics, and Theologies of Relationality, because we're looking specifically at relationality as this framework for policy. Relationality includes both the individual person and the relations and contexts that he or she is in. Relationality is developed in many of our philosophical traditions and also in several theological traditions. Whether you think theologies are the word of the divine or an illuminating metaphor, in both cases they offer us much about how the world and people work, and so about the policies that will lead to the greatest human flourishing. Please join us in this series of conversations. Commonwealth and Covenant was published by Erdman's Press in 2016. You can follow me at marciapally.com or search for me on Facebook and Twitter. I want to move on from covenant, the Möbius strip nature of covenant, to the question of whether this is particularist or universal. A long debate about the Hebrew Bible. As I understand it, the Judaic covenant cannot be understood as particularist, but as particularist and, meaning with the ancient Hebrews and we're going to talk about and with whom. The Judaic covenant was developed in an era when most gods were tribal and indeed particular. In spite of that, the Judaic, in particular meaning each god was the god of the particular tribe and not another tribe, right? We talked about this last time. In spite of this cultural prevalence, the Judaic covenant concerns the fundamental questions of human beings. And the idea of the covenant is that the covenant is understandable without group membership and may be studied and debated and discussed as part of the global discussion of our human circumstances. All persons are expected to know the moral law in the Hebrew Bible. All persons are expected to be responsible for the well-being of the world, for others, and its creatures. The righteous of all of the world, without particular group membership, are expected to follow the universal covenant, as we can see in the Noahide covenant and the covenant with Enoch, and all persons, if they violate the fundamental principles of our covenantal relationship with others, our moral responsibility, all violators, regardless of group membership, are punished. For example, Cain. Yeah? Cain murders his brother in a jealous fit. Yeah? Cain is not Jewish. This is way before the concept of any kind of Hebraic, Judaic, Abrahamic, anything. Nonetheless, Cain violates the moral principles of the Hebrew Bible and is punished, as are all the residents of Sodom and Gomorrah. The moral principles and the covenantal relationships described in the Bible are not particularist, but are expected to be knowable, understandable, and applicable to all people. This is expressed in what looks at first blush to be a particularist covenant. As you know, God forms a covenant with Abraham, and he forms it again with Isaac, and he forms it again with Jacob. And in each time, what are the conditions of the covenant? Quote, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. The telos and purpose of the covenant is that all peoples and the earth are blessed through this bringing of the covenant to the world. In not once, but each time, with Abraham, with Isaac, and Jacob. In case you missed it the first time, or in case you think it's only applicable to the generation of Abraham, it is repeated through all the patriarchs. The purpose of the covenant is the blessing of all humankind. That's what we're doing here. That's where we're going. It's also the universal offer of the covenant, or we could say it a better way, the universal structure of existence is covenantal, is also expressed in the three primary commandments of the Judaic faith: love God, love neighbor, and love the stranger. Here we have again the expression of the Mobius nature of covenant, and it applies to all creatures, or certainly to all human creatures. Love God, which enables you to love neighbor and the stranger, and love of neighbor and stranger expresses your covenantal relationship with God, and that is without group membership. When Jesus repeats this mandate to love God, neighbor, and then in Luke proceeds immediately to tell the story of the Good Samaritan, the story of loving the spurned and hated stranger, he is reprising and repeating the three aspects of the Judaic covenant: love God, love neighbor, love the stranger. Leon Cass puts it this way: what is offered in the Hebrew Bible is not only a national story, not what happened, but rather what always happens to men, women, families, tribes, and states under conditions of prosperity, strife, subjugation, and importantly, when justice is and is not pursued. What is offered in the Hebrew Bible is not what happened to a particular group, but what always happens. Yoram Hazami puts it this way: the law is given because God is concerned about the best possible life for all of God's creatures. The authors of the Bible wish to persuade the readers that there exists a law whose force is of a universal nature because it derives from the way the world itself was made. A law whose force is of a universal nature because it derives from the way the world itself was made. This is a nice summary of what we've been talking about, that the structure of existence is relational or covenantal. We are distinct beings in reciprocal covenantal impact and responsibility to each other. And certain conduct emerges from this nature of existence as distinct beings in covenantal responsibility to the other. Certain modes of conduct emerge from that. The next point that I think is worth discussing for a while is, therefore, how to read the Hebrew Bible. Because there's a great deal in the Hebrew Bible of lying, cheating, violence, aggression, war, betrayal, trickery, and just about every other bad thing humanity has come up with. We do not read the Hebrew Bible to copy these awful actions. The point of the Hebrew Bible is not to mimic it. The Hebrew Bible, its stories, its symbols, its parables, are not historical records. They are not of value for their facticity, nor are they blueprints to be mimicked. They're problem sets, a collection of personal and societal dilemmas. Personal and societal dilemmas through which readers are to derive a code of conduct applicable to all. Wretched behavior in the Bible is to be examined for what it reveals about the human condition. And sometimes, to understand the lessons of tales in the Bible, you have to keep reading and find out what happens in the long term. Generations later, what is the long-term upshot? The beginning of Genesis includes, as we've mentioned, the story of Cain's murder of Abel. And here starts a cycle of jealousy, ambition, and violence that proceeds through 45 or 46 chapters of the book of Genesis. It proceeds in a spiral of mistrust and lying and cheating and violence through 45 to 46 chapters, and doesn't stop until Joseph and his brothers, who sold him into slavery, are reconciled. The end of the book of Genesis is the reconciliation of Joseph and his brothers. If you're going to read that book, you have to read it as a narrative that has a problem at the beginning, a few problems at the beginning, and looks at the long-term consequences of greed, ambition, self-absorption, violence, and it doesn't come to a stop until Joseph and his brothers are reconciled and learn to live with and for each other. And Joseph, although his brothers sold him into slavery, brings his brothers, as well, of course, as his father, to come live with him. And so the book of Genesis ends. No, but there's one more thing in the book of Genesis. There's a famine at the end of the book of Genesis, where all of Egypt, not just Joseph's family, all of Egypt is starving. And it's Joseph's responsibility to organize the care and food distribution for all of Egypt, not only for the family, not only for your own, but for everybody. If we don't understand the Hebrew Bible as a problem set, and if we do not unpack and decode its narratives and symbols, then readers are vulnerable to what Alfred North Whitehead called the fallacy of misplaced correctness. The fallacy of misplaced correctness, or what Catherine Keller calls fallacious factualism. Right? I want to spend a minute particularly with the problem of violence in the Bible. Here we have to be very, very careful not to read literally. For example, if you read in 2 Kings chapter 9, you will read that about the murder of Joram, King Ahab, and Queen Jezebel, which looks like it was at the request of the prophet Elisha. It looks like it is endorsed by God, that these political assassinations are endorsed by God. But just as in the book of Genesis, when you have to read the narrative and see what the long-term consequences are in order to understand the moral and covenantal lesson, you will find, if you keep reading, that 2 generations later, these events are decried as horrid by Hosea. The text is not suggesting that political assassination is an appropriate political tool, but the text is there to show us the long-term consequences of political violence. The ethics that emerges from the notion of covenant that we've been discussing today the notion of covenant, where your covenantal relations, responsibility reciprocally to the other, is an expression of your covenant relation with God, which enables you, because it is the structure of existence, to behave covenantally to others. So, as we've said, certain kinds of behavior emerge from that. Let's start with this from Gustavo Gutierrez, a Peruvian theologian and Dominican priest, who wrote, "To love Yud-He Vav-He, the tetragrammaton that we're not sure how to pronounce, to love Yahweh is to do justice to the poor and the oppressed." In one sentence, summarizing the Moebius strip covenant. Let's take, what does that mean? Let's take the tough case of the enemy. The ethics in biblical and rabbinic thought is that we are to consider the enemy compassionately. The example, the Hebrews must consider even the enslaving Egyptians compassionately. After the third generation, they are to be, quote, accepted into the assembly of the Lord. Some other examples about the enemy. The rabbinic laws of war, Maimonides' laws of war, Nachmanides' laws of war require, for example, that the residents of besieged cities, when you encircle a city and prevent anybody from going in and out, you have a siege, the residents must be allowed to leave unharmed. If you want the city, first, right, we had war from Deuteronomy, you have to sue for peace. You have to ask for a peace settlement before you go to war. 2, even if you go to war and you besiege a city, if you want the city, you can't harm the people. You have to let them leave peaceably. But let's move on now to the stranger. The Hebrew Bible is replete with lessons on how the stranger must be treated. In Exodus 22:21, one of the earliest passages in the Pentateuch, mandates, "Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt." Leviticus 35-37 places such emphasis on aid to the stranger that it uses this type of care to the stranger as a model to how you should treat the needy in your own group. It places such emphasis on how you are to treat the needy among the strangers, and it says, oh yes, and you should treat your own needy this way. Leviticus also mandates that the farmers famously leave the corners of the field, not only for the Hebrew poor, but for all the resident poor. Leviticus 19 mandates that strangers are to be incorporated into the economy so that they don't become poor to begin with. Quote, "The foreigner residing among you must be treated as you are native born. Love them as you love yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt." This might shed some light on the question of immigration today and refugees. You are to incorporate them into your own and your own structures so that they don't become poor and needy to begin with. Ezekiel 47 gives this right of incorporating them into the economy even to land rights. Quote, you are to allot the land as an inheritance for yourselves and for the foreigners residing among you. You are to consider them as native-born Israelites. Along with you, they are to be allotted an inheritance among the tribes of Israel. So we've discussed a few examples of covenantal care even for the enemy in cases of war. We've gone over a few examples of covenantal care for the stranger. And finally, these two are embodied in a very long body of law throughout the Hebrew Bible of care for the needy in general. We leave the corners of the field for the poor. Deuteronomy requires tithing, giving a tenth, so that resources can be given the fatherless and the widows who live in your towns. After 6 years of indentured servitude or slavery, slaves must be manumitted, they must be freed. There is no lifelong servitude in the ethical code of the Hebrew Bible. And not only that, Deuteronomy 15 requires that slaves are not to be manumitted empty-handed. You just can't let them walk out. You have to supply them well with livestock, grain, and wine when you let your slaves go. In fact, if there's a slave who wants to remain as a servant in the house of the master, there's a special ceremony that you have to go through to make sure that consent is given and that this is really what's wanted. Yeah? In fact, Julian, the Emperor Julian, was enjoining the Galatian high priest to improve poor relief in the Roman Empire. And as an example, Julian noted that the Jews and the Galileans did a far better job of caring for the needy than Rome itself did. It is disgraceful, Julian wrote in 362 of the Common Era, that when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans support not only their own poor, but ours as well, all men see that our people lack aid from us. 3 examples regarding the enemy, the stranger, and the needy in general, of what a covenantal disposition to the world. I want to come back to your question. Covenantal understanding of the world and a covenantal understanding of yourself in the world would mean for your behavior. If you are covenantally inclined, if that's how you see the world, what would it mean for the enemy? Tough case. Stranger and needy.
Seen like this, it makes everything very clear, and it's I'm just weighed down by the hundreds of people drowning in the Mediterranean these days, and it's so, yeah. If everybody was reading their texts, we would have a better world. But it's like, I mean, there's such a powerlessness.
That's somewhat the suggestion of Commonwealth and Covenant, is that we are taking our covenantal setup seriously, and so we're coming to some very poor outcomes, and that we need to reconsider our covenantal setup, whether we take it as the literal word of God, or as an illuminating text, or as a metaphor, or as a wisdom tradition, that we need to be considering some of these things. Look what happens generation after generation as examples, either of family violence or political violence in the Bible. You come to some very poor outcomes. And you'll keep coming to poor outcomes unless you make an effort to act as a moral agent and stop it.
And also, I don't know if you developed some kind of idea about how to bring, not everybody, but as many people as possible to think on these topics without coming to a university and have a lecture about this, or without being, without having a master's degree or a PhD, or without being a professor.
Suggestions?
So in the first line, it's some empowerment for you, I think, so that you get along, become clear with special topics that are interesting for you, and maybe in a way guiding actions. And by example giving, you have the chance, if someone asks, to lay open the foundations of why you are acting the way you do. So, but in the first way, I think it's something you have to do on your own.
I mean, to start like acting like this.
The explanation comes from this. Sorry.
No,
Sorry.
Sorry,
Sorry, but you.
Well, it's too big to me, you know. This is not our mission or something. It's a good idea, and you can think about it. We've got to act according to covenant. That is not a new idea. It's very nicely written down. That's okay, but it's a well, universal, basic idea to act according to covenant. And that was the idea of millions of people before. It's the idea of martyrs, of decent people, of you and me. So it's not that big an idea, and we five, well, I'm here.
No.
Will be the nucleus.
Now we go to the third word.
This way.
Oh, okay, sorry.
But it is, you can take this text, you can take another text, you can go to other traditions, wisdom traditions, as you like. But it is a kind of training for you to, from
you,
time.
I hope. And for you too, I hope.
Yes,
Yeah.
for you.
Only you.
For you, meaning us.
Yeah.
For us.
Sorry. It's kind of training, and a language training, and a thought training. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's good.
As simple as that.
Yeah. But still, maybe I don't want to be too pessimistic. Maybe covenant irrevocably, irrevocable and universal has been modified by God in the way it has been modified looking at Abraham. He doesn't talk to him anymore.
When he fails as a moral
sure.
agent.
I don't know. It's it's eternal. Huh? Still, it's been modified, and that's what what I understood you meant.
I didn't mean that covenant has been modified. It's just the particular relation. What I meant, you can continue this, I think, in a nice way. It's not that God modified his covenant with humanity. It's that there was a particular close relationship in the story between God, right, whatever, and Abraham, and that this comes to an end.
But Abraham stands for mankind too.
Okay, so you're interpreting it
in a certain way.
So how
all
would you?
These stories are that's what I understood.
Yeah.
All these stories are to tell us something about general ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So this relationship between God and Abram is an example too. And maybe, again, I don't want to be too pessimistic, he doesn't talk to us anymore.
No, that is bloody pessimistic. What would you make?
Well, he sends an angel, though.
Wait, no. I want to ask, what would you make then that then immediately thereafter in the next chapters, God makes a covenant with Isaac, and then of course there's a mess in that family, and then he makes another one with Jacob. There's a mess in that family, and then he makes again with the reconciliation of Joseph and his brothers. So there's a complicated
Sure. We
story.
get back to it's eternal. It's sure.
Yeah.
It's what I think too. Still, I think just to do a little of
Provocation.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, the optimistic news is that the covenantal structure of reality, of existence, is not extinguished. Yeah. That we mess it up all the time is a reality we face every day. Optimistically, if the covenantal structure of existence doesn't change, there is at least the potential that we can act on it individually in our personal lives and perhaps in larger arenas like politics and economics. There's the potential. of when we talked about evolutionary biology, that in fact, even if you look from a biological, the optimism is that we are wired for cooperation. That's the gleam of optimism. What we are going to do with our persistent violation of a cooperative setup is perhaps the profound question facing us. How each of us behaves as a moral person in the world has to do with how we understand, I think, the situatedness or the relation part of distinction and relation. We talked a couple of times already that, of course, we have relations to those near. Every child develops with relations to those near, but the factors influencing the child's development and the circumstances of the parents and the siblings and the community, those factors might not be determined by people near. They may be determined in Brussels or in Washington or in some capital or in the United Network. They may be, or Wall Street, they may be determined by people who are at some distance. And I think something about our moral agency, our moral correspondence with the setup of existence, asks us to think about how are you going to behave as a moral agent with those, as we keep saying, those layers of relation. Okay, this might be your family, but wait a minute, we live in economic systems, we live in political systems. How do we vote? What do we tell our representatives to do? What do we organize for political and economic policy? How much time do we have during the day to do all of this? This is the question of moral agency.
Somewhere it says in the reading, it said that God is where there's love and charity.
We have that today.
Yeah.
God,
yeah.
It can be where justice, love, and justice are in the world. Yes.
In my experience, I work with people who are affected with addiction, alcoholism, and drugs and stuff. And my experience is it's really true that when one person starts to work on themselves and gets better, their whole family gets better. So this is really interesting because it does have an immense power when one person makes a change for life rather than death or negativity. So maybe that's a bit more hopeful.
I want to support that by, it is in Commonwealth and Covenant in a chapter we've done in part 1, chapter 3, in the section on evolutionary biology. Some contemporary biologists studying not hunter-gatherer societies or primates and so on, but studying contemporary urban societies found that acts of generosity or kindness actually spread in a network, not just one to one to one to one, but if one person makes a small generous gesture, that ripples out. You know, we have plenty of good books on economics and politics that take our interconnectedness into account. We have really quite a few. And they're discussed at very fancy meetings, and they go unimplemented. And I think they go unimplemented because the worldview is lacking. And so we try to, the moral task in front of us is how to make the worldview more present. Rather than optimistically, I think, well, what would the world look like if people it didn't occur to anybody to do anything else?